Hi, everybody. Welcome to 32Soft's 49th webinar. I'm Denise, your host for today's session, and with me to present is QAD and MRP expert Don Lindsey, to whom I will hand off very quickly because there is much to be covered. It is with great enthusiasm I get to introduce Don Lindsey again this month. About half of you joined us last month for Don's 32Soft webinar debut, but for those of you who might not yet know him, Don is a highly skilled consultant, project manager, trainer, and business analyst for all areas of QAD, and his experience includes several large, complex QAD ERP projects. Don spent significant time dedicated to manufacturing systems management, service, support, and finance. His diverse background includes a wide variety of manufacturing industries, including medical, electronics, industrial, consumer products. In addition to QAD Explore and QAD Regional User Group conferences, Don has spoken for many years at the APIX conferences. He has also taught at the APIX certification program at California State Fullerton for over 20 years. Quoting the Dalai Lama, share your knowledge. It's a way to achieve immortality. All of us at 32Soft are pretty sure Don is already immortal, and we are delighted to have him as our friend and colleague.
MRP basically has three objectives. The first is to make sure that you have materials available for production and for the products that you're going to produce. It also allows you to maintain the lowest possible inventory and production levels of your items. And it also is a very effective planning tool for scheduling both work orders and purchase orders. So MRP is a tool that allows you to have the right item at the right quantity at the right time. By the end of the session, we are hoping that we can get a firm understanding of the role of MRP in ERP, describe the process, its inputs, outputs, and feedback, the basic calculation process, look a little bit about the bills of material and what that means in terms of the MRP explosion, understand lead time explosion, and offsetting in our MRP, and we'll take a look at the specific QAD menu structure where you would find the data elements that we'll talk about, and then how a planner might optimize those planning elements. If you remember from last session on the 13th, we talked about this ERP2 closed loop system. Well, today we're going to concentrate primarily on MRP. The closed loop system starts up at the top with business planning that feeds down into production planning. Master scheduling, we'll talk about that a little bit, how that feeds into material requirements planning. And then we'll concentrate primarily on this MRP portion. And then later, I believe sometime Denise can fill us in. We have a session planned for production activity control, shop floor control, etc. So we're going to talk about MRP. Now, we talked on the 13th about demand. Independent demand is the demand that is at the randomness of customer demand. You can't always make sure that you know exactly what the customer is going to require. And so you need to forecast independent demand. The product structure underneath the independent demand item is where MRP resides. So we're going to talk about the dependent demand and this parent component relationship, and that is where we're going to look at MRP. Now, MRP is based on a principle that we refer to as the principle of exception. We only manage that which goes wrong, not that which goes right. If you have 10,000 items in your MRP database, and only 100 are what is called out of phase with the plan, then MRP is only going to direct you at those 100 parts. So it's the principle of exception that we're going to see in MRP. The inputs to MRP are basically the master production schedule, and we talked about the independent demand and the fact that we have to do forecasts at that level, and we use firm planned orders in that area, and that is done by people. The bill of material is the structure of your product. Again, people do that. And then you have the planning data that the planners and the buyers are responsible for, the lead times, the order policies, etc., that we'll talk about in just a second. And there you go, people. And then finally, you have inventory status, the warehouse, quantity on hand, cycle counting, all that information about what the on-hand quantity is. So I always get upset when I hear users say, it's the system. It's not the system. People make the system work. And that's what we're here today to do, is to understand how MRP works and make that system better. The characteristics of MRP are, first of all, it's product-oriented. It's a bill of material, as opposed to the reorder point that we looked at last webinar. MRP is built on this parent-component relationship. Back in the late 1960s, Ollie White and George Plossel and another other individuals associated with IBM gave us this MRP ability to explode a product structure through a time period, so we can look forward and anticipate what our requirements are going to be from QAD. It's time phase. There's the difference between the release date and the start date, all based upon our calendars, and we'll look at where those calendars are set up in QAD. And it's flexible. You can run the explosion and recalculate your requirements on a almost an hourly basis. There are some prerequisites for MRP. First of all, you have to have demand data. We talked about the fact that you have the independent demand items. You need to forecast that. You've got your bill of material, which we'll look at in just a second. Quantity per, scrap factors, etc. Your shop order data, because that's what we call scheduled receipts. The due dates, the anticipated receipt in the inventory, open material requirements, allocations, which we'll talk about. And then inventory records, quantity on hand. I hope we all have a cycle count program where we do physical inventory, because that's the starting point of MRP. Purchase orders, same as shop orders. You need to know what your lead times are, what your due dates are. And then finally, you need a computer. And I love the fact that I see so many organizations not paying attention to the data elements and the use of MRP in their ERP system, but they use spreadsheets. Spreadsheets don't work for MRP. I don't care how many planners use it. The lead time, explosion, and offsetting. Here we've got a simple bill of material with the lead time that it takes to build each level in this product structure. So the time from when an order is placed until a part is ready for use, that is the lead time. We explode that by multiplying the parent requirements by the usage through the product tree. And then we offset that by the lead time based on either the planner or the buyer's estimate of how long it's going to take to actually place the order and have it ready for use. The bill of material is the basis of MRP. Back in the 1960s, when George and Ollie invented MRP, they figured out how to take a due date of a final assembly, take the offset of the amount of time that it takes to build that particular product, and then use that in the MRP explosion. If you look at the total amount of lead time, that's what's called cumulative manufacturing lead time. And if you're in a responsibility of forecasting, you've got to remember that you need to forecast at least that cumulative manufacturing lead time. The basic process of MRP follows this dance of determining the gross requirements, and we'll look at how we do that, then determining available inventory on hand, scheduled receipts, and then projecting that across the horizon, then calculating what we call net requirements. If you have a projected quantity on hand that's negative, that's the same as a net requirement. MRP is going to plan an order release for that period, offset it by the lead time to calculate the difference between the due date and the release date, and then write action messages. And that's what MRP does in its explosion process. This is done by low-level code. We'll talk about low-level code in just a second. By item, by time period. So if you were to look at an example of this MRP explosion, if we've got a requirement for level 0, parent E, that means we have a gross requirement at the level 1, component A1. So the gross requirement or the net requirement of the parent becomes the gross requirement of the component. Then we look at on hand and scheduled receipts to come up with total available. And instead of needing 100 of component B1, we actually only need 73. So the net requirement of the parent becomes the gross requirement of the component. In this case, we got 5 and a scheduled receipt for 25 or 30. Then we've got 43. That drives down to component C1. C1 has a gross requirement of 43. On hand, scheduled receipt, available, net, gross, available. And so you can see that we don't have any requirements or net requirements for our component 4. So that's the explosion and netting process for those components. If we look at just a basic MRP record, we can see here that we've got a lead time on this item of 2 weeks. We've got 5 periods out in the future where we've got a gross requirement coming from a parent, a scheduled receipt of 20, and we'll define scheduled receipts as paperwork released. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And we have a projected quantity available as 10. So if we simply go through and do this netting process, you can see we've got 10 at the end of period 1. We've got 30 projected available at period 2 because we've got the 10 and the 20. That 30 follows into period 3. Period 4 has 30 because we have no requirements in period 4. Now in period 5, we see 35, and that means we have a negative projected available. A negative projected available means we have a net requirement. A net requirement means we need to plan an order. We need to offset it by lead time. And MRP assumes that you're going to do what it says, and you're going to release that in period 3, and it's going to come into inventory, and your new projected available at the end of period 5 is 0. So that's the basic flow of an MRP record. Now, if we expand that and we look at this part I, or part number 1, it goes into X. It also goes into Y. And as we saw from last week, or last webinar, we also have some independent demand for this part 1. We've got 95 on hand. We've got allocations of 20, a safety stock requirement of 3, and our lot size is 100. So if I look at the gross requirements across the periods 1 through 8 of part number 1, you can see that in the first period, that gross requirements comes from a forecast or a master schedule of 1 in period, or 15 in period 1. And then since 1 goes into X and the 4-week lead time from period 6 back to period 2 says I've got a gross requirement of 40 in that period 2. Same thing for period 3, period 4, period 5, and finally period 6. So that's the gross requirement, the accumulation of those gross requirements from all parents into the time period for this particular item that we're looking at. If you then go through that netting process, you can see we've got 95, we've got 15, and an allocation of 20. So we've got 60 available at the projected available at the end of period 1. Goes to 20. Now we've got a scheduled receipt of 100 in period 3 and a gross requirement of 40. That means our net projectable is 80. That 80 follows into period 4, so 30 minus 80 is 50. We've got 35 at the end of period 5. That carries to 6. Now we've got a negative 10 projected quantity on hand. So if you look at the offset, you can see that we've got 90 coming in now based on that, minus the 10, and then that covers into the next period. So that's kind of how MRP looks at an item in its gross requirement. And now if you look at the planned orders for the release versus receipt, we've got this rule that the planned order release of the parent becomes the gross requirement of the component in terms of both date and quantity per. So if you've got 50 here at period 5 for that B item, that's going to drive down in release because the lead time of that B is 1 period. B takes C and D, so that 50 release is going to feed down to the receipt in the period 2, lead time offset, lead time offset. So that's how the system calculates the explosion of those net requirements. There's some assumptions that MRP makes. Number one, you're going to do what it says. It assumes you've told it the truth. So you need to make sure that what you are telling QAD is actually the truth in terms of lead times, lot sizes, etc. There's an assumption that it's easier to expedite an order than place a new order. And we'll talk about that in terms of the realignment or rescheduling messages. And if you told MRP it's going to take a number of days to place an order or complete a work order, that it assumes it's going to be done in that time. It tells you to expedite and delay, and if it tells you that, it assumes you're successful with that. And then finally, one of my old supply chain managers used to tell me that, have you told MRP everything you know? If you haven't, then you need to make sure that MRP knows it. There are some order modifiers that exist in QAD, and here's a quick picture of the planning data that we'll talk about. The discrete lot size, the fixed order quantity, and we talked about EOQ last week. There's a period order quantity, and then there's a whole series of these order modifiers, and we'll look at how those will take place. So here you can see that we've got an armrest and an arm assembly. We've got a lead time of 1 week. We've got on hand of 50 and 10, lot size of 25. Our period order quantity is 4, and a minimum order quantity is 25 and 60. So if you look at the requirements for this arm assembly, and recognizing we have a scheduled receipt of 50 in period 3, you can go ahead and look at the calculation of the release and the due date of that armrest assembly. such that we finally arrive at our projected on hand. Now we're going to drive that down into the armrest based on the product structure. And again, now we can look at the order modifiers. We saw that there's a period order quantity of 4. So MRP is going to go out and it's going to look at the 4 periods out the future and accumulate those into a planned order. It's going to offset the planned order release. That's going to come in, and we're going to go out and project another -50 out in period 8. That is going to look at the next 4 periods again, offset it by 1, and we'll have 10 available. So those order policy modifiers allow the planner to schedule either in terms of lot for lot, the EOQ we looked at last week, or these period order quantities. There's what are called uncashed requisitions. Allocations. Allocations exist for shop orders that are released but have not been actually taken to the warehouse to have picked. MRP allocates or handles allocations as an additional gross requirement for the allocated items. And you can see here, you can see uncashed or allocations in QAD in the menu 13.8. There are also a number of utilities that QAD gives you to help manage those allocations. Sometimes allocations get hung up, so you can look at the LDD or the LADD tables and clean up those allocations. We talked about safety stock last week. Safety stock is used to guard against demand. And the recommendation for safety stock in an MRP environment is that you use safety stock at the highest levels of the bill of material or the lowest levels of the bill of material. If you use safety stock at the intermediate levels of bills of material, you can cause QAD to carry dead inventory and can have MRP expedite when it's not needed, de-expedite, and that tends to lose credibility in MRP. And then you fall back on spreadsheets, which is never a good idea. There's a yield factor in QAD, and this is the ratio of unusable or usable output from a process relative to its input. So if you fill in 1.4.7 or 1.4.17 a yield factor, you can see that QAD is going to add what's referred to as a scrap factor in the MRP for every planned order. If we look at that in terms of, we can see that this scrap factor of 10% says that you're going to add 10% to the bill of material for that, and you're going to go through that same netting process. And then at the armless level, we're going to see those planned order releases drive down as gross requirements into that component. There's a scrap factor also in QAD's MRP, and this is on the bill of material parent component relationship. And this is a component that is wasted during the assembly of the parent. If you look at this again, you can see that on that scrap factor, now if I calculate that, you can see that the planned order release is different by those quantities from the yield factor calculation down to 12, 112, and 112. MRP order statuses tell MRP what the current circumstance is around that particular order. We have planned orders, firm planned orders, which are used in the master production schedule, released orders, closed, and purchase orders. The steps in releasing the order are, first of all, check your action messages from MRP, and we'll look at how we do that. Then check it, material availability, create the shop packet or purchase requisition, which is sometimes called the scheduled receipt or paperwork released. Allocate components to the work order in 1613.1, and then release the planned order creating the scheduled receipt. Scheduled receipts are basically defined as paperwork released. You can't change a scheduled receipt as easily can as a planned order. 2310 brings us to our planned order approval process. And when you walk through that, this will generate a firm planned order for each one of those planned orders. So it's going to change it from an F or a P MRP status to an F MRP status. Same thing with 2311 planned order releases. This generates a purchase requisition in the amount of each one of those planned orders. Rescheduling. As we had said before, MRP reschedules or is a good tool to help us keep our schedules intact. Once we run the re-explosions, we can replan MRP. And MRP uses a couple of rules to do that reschedule. If I look at my assembly or my MRP explosion again, you can see I've got a scheduled receipt in period 3, a scheduled receipt in period 6, and a scheduled receipt in period 9. The rules for misalignment are that an open order scheduled for a period in which the on-hand in the previous goes negative, period 2, it will expedite it, or if the order is in a period where the gross requirements is equal to or less than the projected in quantity in hand, it's going to tell us to de-expedite, and if there's no requirements, it's going to tell us to cancel it. So if we go through here, you can see that it's going to tell you to expedite that 200 from period 2 to period 3 to period 2. That's going to bring me down to here. I have a scheduled receipt of 50 available in period 5, 0 in period 6 as a gross requirement. That means I don't need that, so it's going to tell me to de-expedite that. And I don't have any requirement for this arm assembly out past period 9, so it's going to tell me to cancel that. So those are the rules for misalignment. If you look at the order action messages, MRP has a tool that allows you to deal with all of the order action messages. There are over 50 action messages in QAD that you should become aware of. The rules or the requirement for accuracy in MRP cannot be stated enough. Effective use of MRP requires knowledge, planners who know what they're doing, accuracy in terms of on-hand, on-order, planning data, and a regular discipline for bills of material, inventory, and shop floor control. If we look at the individual menus within QAD where these data elements are contained, you can see in 1.4.7 item planning or 1.4.17 item site planning, we've got these requirements of master scheduling, order policy, lead times. So you can review what your order policies are in terms of how MRP is going to use those. In terms of the product structure, here's the parent component relationship, the quantity per, the start date, and those scrap factors we talked about. Same thing in terms of formulas. In the transaction by item browse, you're going to see all of the transactions that affect quantity on hand. And quantity on hand is a starting point of the MRP netting process. So if that's not correct, MRP is not going to be correct. There are 23 different transactions that affect quantity on hand. So if you've got a cycle count process, you need to be able to understand what each one of those transactions is and how that has affected that quantity on hand. In terms of the MRP explosion, there's 3 types of MRP explosions: net change, regeneration, selective. Net change says that anything that has affected this particular item will cause the planned order box in MRP or in 1.4.7 to be checked. And so you should use 23.1 to do net change. Regeneration deletes all planned orders and replans them throughout the entire product structure. And then selective MRP replans only that item. We talked about the low-level code. You should probably run this low-level code update at least once or twice a month, and this resets the low-level code for the item. It's the lowest level for this part that will be found in any bill of material in the system, and it allows MRP to calculate those gross requirements by time period. You need to set your calendar dates and your holiday dates so that MRP knows which dates you're going to work. There's also a number of MRP utilities: rebuild, delete of MRP without work orders, delete unused reports, and then to validate MRP production forecast data. And you go in and look at each one of those. The control file is how you set the MRP process. You define the horizon. If you're using DRP, Distribution Requirements Planning, and MRP, you can check that. Defaults, this is the order release horizon. So when you have those planned order releases, you're only going to see those action messages 7 days out in the future. And then these app server and threads have to do with how many IT servers you've got going. So the benefits of MRP are significant and many. Reduces inventory, reduces component shortages, lowers cost, improves scheduling accuracies, enhances the productivity, and achieves the ultimate greater customer satisfaction. Just a word, I've seen a lot on the internet lately in regards to how useless MRP is, and that you should not use MRP and start using some of these more recent netting processes such as DDMRP, etc. So be cautious about that. Make MRP work, and then if you want to enhance MRP, you can go on and look at those features. So,
as I mentioned at the top, today is our 49th webinar. So when we return from summer break in September, 32Soft will celebrate our 50th webinar. I usually avoid animations, but I kind of like the balloons. Olena will return in September to show how easy it is to identify, verify, and minimize production variances with End the Nightmare of Work Order Closing. And to celebrate our 50th, we will have 2 $50 Amazon gift card drawings, and the first is today. So those of you who can hang on and complete our post-webinar survey in a couple of minutes, it's only 2 to 3 questions, we will enter you automatically and do our first drawing. Today's odds are really good, so be sure to hang on for just a minute. As for the second drawing, keep an eye out for the Encore email that I mentioned. It will tell you how to get entered automatically for the second drawing and multiple times. Hint, hint, register for September's webinar. Also in September, we have the first of our fall conferences. We will again attend the Midwest User Group and West Coast User Group conferences. So if you plan to attend, please do plan to visit with us. Pain and innovation means replacing the best practices of today with those of tomorrow. Hang on, everybody, because the survey is going to be right with us. And I'm just going to thank everyone very much for your time today. Hopefully you found it to have been well spent. And we all certainly hope you'll join us again in September. Have a great day, a safe and super rest of summer, everybody. And Don, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, and stay cool.
Yes, and stay cool.